Julian had no intention of going out that Saturday. After the divorce, silence had become his only consistent companion. A heavy blanket he pulled tight around his shoulders. But his friends were relentless. They texted, they called, they showed up at his door with that specific brand of aggressive cheerfulness that refuses to take no for an answer. They told him he was turning into a ghost in his own home. So, against every instinct screaming at him to stay hidden, he went. Hold on just a moment before we continue. If this story is touching something in you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely makes a difference and helps me bring you more stories like this one. I also want to hear from you. Write in the comments. Where are you right now? Are you tucked away in a peaceful village where stars fill the sky, or surrounded by the hum and glow of a city that never sleeps? He arrived at the gathering late. The air in the den was already thick with cigar smoke and the sharp clatter of ice against crystal. It was a high-stakes card night, loud and boisterous. Everything Julian wasn't feeling. He moved through the room like a shadow, his presence barely displacing the air. He watched faces he had known for years, men who were laughing, bluffing, and drinking, and he felt like he was watching a movie in a foreign language. He couldn't find the rhythm. His mind kept drifting back to his empty apartment, to the echo of a life that had dismantled itself piece by piece. When Julian finally sat at the felt table, he played mechanically. He looked at the numbers and the suits, but he didn't see them. His friends threw light jabs at him, commenting on his stone-faced demeanor. They thought he was putting on a poker face. They didn't realize it was just the numbness of grief. Inevitably, his lack of focus cost him. He went all in on a hand he should have folded, watching his stack of chips get swept away by a friend with a pair of kings and a smug grin. The table roared. Penalty time, the winner announced, slapping the table. The room went quiet, that anticipatory hush where mischief takes over. Truth or dare? Julian stared at the empty space where his chips had been. Dare, he muttered. He just wanted it over with. He wanted a distraction, a jolt of adrenaline, anything to break the monotony of his own sadness. All right, his friend said, pointing toward the sliding glass doors that led to the patio. Go find Margaret. Tell her she's the only decent thing that came out of your marriage. Give her a real hug, not that polite handshake garbage. Thank her for sticking by you. Julian froze. Margaret, his ex-wife's mother. She was inside, likely reading in the sunroom away from the noise. It felt like a trap, but it also felt necessary. Margaret had been the Switzerland in their war. She hadn't taken sides. She hadn't cut him off. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy, and walked toward the glass doors. The noise of the party faded as he stepped into the cooler air of the sunroom. Margaret was there, just as he expected, nursing a cup of tea, a book resting on her lap. She looked up startled. Her face carried the same elegance it always had, though the worry lines around her eyes had deepened over the last year. Julian, she asked softly. He cleared his throat, feeling foolish. I lost a bet, he started then stopped. That felt cheap. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the pretense dropped. Actually, they dared me to tell you the truth. And the truth is, thank you. You were the only one who treated me like a human being through all of this. Margaret's eyes softened. She set her book down. She knew the wreckage he was walking through because she had watched it from the sidelines. She stood and took a step toward him. Your family, Julian. A piece of paper doesn't change that. You did your best. Hearing those words, you did your best, cracked something open in his chest. Before he could overthink it, he stepped in and hugged her. It was supposed to be a dare, a joke for the guys in the other room. But as his arms went around her, and he felt the steady, calm warmth of her embrace, the joke vanished. He held on a second too long. She didn't pull away. It wasn't a romantic embrace, not exactly. But it was intimate. It was two survivors finding a raft in the middle of an ocean. For a fleeting moment, the smell of her perfume and the solidity of her presence grounded him in a way he hadn't felt in months. When he pulled back, the air between them was charged. Not with scandal, but with a sudden, sharp awareness. They looked at each other, and a silent conversation passed in the span of a heartbeat. She saw his loneliness. He saw her quiet empathy. And beneath it all, a hum of something else, a connection that had suddenly shifted from familial to personal. Julian walked back to the card table, his heart hammering a strange rhythm. The guys cheered, clapping him on the back, oblivious. They didn't see that his hands were trembling slightly. They didn't know that the game had ended for him the moment he stepped into that sunroom. The night dragged on, but Julian was no longer present. His mind was anchored in the sunroom, replaying the softness of her voice and the way the tension had melted from his shoulders when she held him. He left early, driving home through empty streets, confused and unsettled. It wasn't that he was in love with Margaret. That was absurd, wasn't it? It was that she had given him a glimpse of being understood, and he was starving for it. The days that followed were a blur of routine, but the memory of that embrace refused to fade. It sat in the back of his mind like a dormant ember. He tried to busy himself with work, with running errands, but the silence of his apartment felt louder than before. Margaret, too, found herself distracted. She went about her gardening and her reading, but her thoughts kept drifting to Julian's eyes, the raw vulnerability she had seen there. She had always cared for him, but that hug had broken a barrier she hadn't realized was there. She felt a protective pull, mixed with a confusing, subtle thrill she hadn't felt in years. Their next meeting was accidental. Julian was at the local nursery, buying plants he probably wouldn't keep alive, and there she was. They froze near the hydrangeas. The polite script they usually followed, "How are you?" "Fine," felt inadequate now. They started talking, real talking. Standing there in the aisle, surrounded by blooming flowers, Julian spoke about the crushing weight of starting over. Margaret listened, not with judgment, but with a steady presence that made him feel safe. The conversation moved from the nursery to a nearby cafe. They sat for hours. It became a pattern. A text here, a coffee there. They told themselves it was innocent. They were just two people coping with the fallout of a shattered family. But the emotional current running beneath their words was undeniable. Then came the storm. It was late October, and a torrential downpour had knocked out the power grid in Margaret's neighborhood. Julian, knowing she was alone, drove over to check on her. The house was dark, lit only by the flickering glow of a few candles she had placed on the mantel. "I just wanted to make sure the generator kicked in," he said, shaking the rain from his coat. "It didn't," she admitted with a small, tired smile. "But the tea is still hot." They sat in her living room, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm against the glass. The shadows made the room feel small, intimate, a world apart from reality. They talked about things they had never voiced before. Margaret spoke of her own regrets, the loneliness of her widowhood, the dreams she had quietly folded away. Julian confessed his deepest insecurities, the feeling that he was fundamentally broken. In the candlelight, the years between them seemed to dissolve. Julian looked at her, the way the light danced in her eyes, the grace of her hands as she held her cup, and he felt a pull so strong it frightened him. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was a profound resonance. Margaret felt it too. She reached out, her fingers brushing his forearm to emphasize a point, and the contact sent a jolt through both of them. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with the question neither dared to ask. "We're walking a fine line, Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She didn't pull her hand away. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "But I don't want to step back." "It's not about what we want," she said gently. "It's about what we can live with." She was right, and he knew it. But in that moment, in the safety of the storm, the connection felt like the only real thing left in his life. They didn't cross the physical line that night. No forbidden kiss, no betrayal of the past, but the emotional boundary had been obliterated. They had seen each other's souls, and there was no unseeing it. The weeks that followed were a tightrope walk. Every interaction was laced with a sweetness that bordered on pain. They were finding a sanctuary in each other that the rest of the world couldn't understand. Julian felt seen. Margaret felt vital. But the shadow of reality was always looming. She was his ex-wife's mother. The complexity of it was a tangled, knot that could choke them both if they pulled too hard. One evening, the inevitable conversation finally happened. Julian had come over for dinner, and the air was thick with things unsaid. Margaret looked at him across the table, and he saw a resolve in her eyes that broke his heart before she even spoke. "I'm going to stay with my brother in the city for a few months," she said. It wasn't a question. Julian set his fork down. The room felt suddenly cold. "Why?" he asked, though he already knew. "Because this." She gestured between them. "This is beautiful, Julian. But it's a bridge, not a destination. We are healing each other, but if we keep going, we're going to hurt people, including ourselves." Julian wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that he didn't care about what people thought, that he needed her. But looking at her, he realized she was protecting him. She was the wise one, the one strong enough to make the call he couldn't. He stood up and walked to her. "I don't want to lose this," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You won't," she promised, standing to face him. "You've remembered who you are, Julian. You're not the broken man who walked into that card game. You're whole again. I helped you see that. That was my role." The goodbye was quiet. There were no tears, just a heavy, solemn embrace, an echo of that first dare, but this time filled with a deep, aching respect. She held him, and he memorized the feeling of peace she gave him, knowing he would have to carry it alone from now on. Margaret left the next morning. The house felt empty without her nearby, but strangely, Julian didn't slide back into the darkness. The hollow feeling in his chest was gone, replaced by a sense of clarity. He threw himself back into his life. He reconnected with old friends, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to live. He realized that Margaret had been right. She had been the lighthouse that guided him off the rocks, but he had to sail the ship himself. Months later, a letter arrived. The handwriting was elegant and familiar. It was brief. She wrote that she was happy, that the distance had given her perspective, and that she hoped he was finding joy. She wrote that some connections are gifts that aren't meant to be kept, only treasured for what they taught us. Julian sat on his porch, reading the letter as the sun dipped below the horizon. He smiled, a real, genuine smile. He didn't feel longing anymore, only a profound sense of gratitude. He thought back to that poker night, to the loud laughter and the clinking chips, and the dare that had terrified him. He realized now that the dare hadn't been to hug his mother-in-law. The real dare had been to let himself feel something again, to be vulnerable, to let someone in. He folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. The air was crisp, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like a fog. It looked like a road, and he was finally ready to walk it. Some moments in life arrive disguised as mistakes. A lost hand of cards, a foolish dare, a rainy night. But sometimes, those are the moments that save us. Julian learned that love isn't always about possession, and intimacy isn't always about romance. Sometimes, it's just about two people holding up a light for one another until they're strong enough to walk out of the dark.